Tales from my detective grandfather. Well, gentlemen, I got the wire for my soapbox, which means it's time for some fascinating stories. As I told you before, my late grandfather served in the police force from Soviet times until the end of the 1990s. More precisely, he was an investigator in the only department in a small town near Moscow. He was a very taciturn and gloomy man, but if you asked him about his work he became a little more talkative. I think work was the only thing he loved. So when I was younger, and I was already fascinated by the paranormal, I spent a lot of time in his kitchen in the evenings, asking him about the most interesting cases in his practice. After my grandfather died, in the room that served as his office there was a thick notebook, which, apparently, served as his diary, in which he recorded information about the most strange, so to speak, cases. I had a chance to borrow this diary from my grandmother several times, and while reading it, I thought of my grandfather as if he were a mathematician. Nothing literary, no personal opinion. Just the dry facts available: location of a corpse, forensics evaluation, suspects, etc. A few theories, a couple of notes. It occurred to me at the time that even in his spare time he was still working one way or another, and trying to solve these problems. Most of what he wrote down correlated with the stories I'd heard from him, but there were a few that I hadn't heard anything about at all. So if you suddenly like the stories, I have all the information you need. I may even go to my grandmother's to look through the necessary diary pages of unknown cases, and take pictures of the former crime scenes, and then we can try to guess for ourselves what happened there. As I said again, I wanted to write something like a book about those events, and I once took pictures of the places in question, so I will accompany my tales with photos and some explanations. Not always, for obvious reasons. There will be photos of that particular apartment or staircase where the crime took place, for example. In some cases I was too much of a pussy to go to the places in question, because the neighborhoods, as well as the city as a whole, is still riddled with criminals. A smeared dormitory full of former convicts and drug addicts, I can simply not go, and also the intercom to get in has been moved. Well, I would also add that no colorful descriptions of monsters and stuff like that will be here. Many cases still reek quite strongly of mysticism, but they can be explained if desired, fitting into the framework of familiar phenomena. But I can promise you blackness, dismemberment, and romance in shitty hallways in slum dwellings. Oh yeah, I'm not a photographer, and instead of an SLR I have a digital camera. Let's go. The first case I want to tell you about happened in '93, and it's interesting because I couldn't explain what happened. This post will be accompanied by two photos, the first of the house, where the incident took place, the second of the staircase in which the body was lying, the second entrance, the span between the third and fourth floor, for the most meticulous. So, evening, around 10 o'clock, the investigative team, in a small town made up of whoever is willing to, by and large, arrives at the corpse. But there was an investigator and a criminalist, as a rule. And this was the picture they saw on this very stairwell: a body with a lot of fucking blood under it, the head separated from the body and lying very close to it. The edges of the wound were torn. It was immediately visible, according to my grandfather. It was like it was chewed, he said. On the body in about a dozen places the clothes, consisting of sweatpants, sweater, and slippers, were torn. Wounds could be seen on the skin. It was immediately obvious that the corpse was quite fresh, which was confirmed immediately by the criminalist. Rigor mortis had not yet set in, which meant that even 2 hours had not yet passed since the death. This was confirmed later when the inconsolable widow of the man who lived on the fourth floor was questioned, whose apartment door was 3 meters up the stairs from the body and who, incidentally, had discovered the corpse. The woman was a heavy drinker and was already quite drunk, but they were able to figure it out at once. The man had gone to take out the trash at about 9:30 p.m. When 15 minutes had passed, the woman began to worry that the man might have stopped by to see his drinking buddies, who liked to sit on the bench in the evening, and drink the strong stuff. The windows of the apartment did not overlook the courtyard, if I remember correctly, so she was about to drag the man home, but when she left the apartment and walked just a few steps up the stairs, she saw a mutilated body in a pool of blood. They were unable to get more out of her during the following interrogations. Now for the interesting part, interrogations of citizens living in the house yielded nothing at all. Not one person in the house could hear any shouting, any rushing, any sounds of fighting, or anything else. And this is taking into account how the doors were in those days. These pieces of plywood didn't really provide any soundproofing. There were indeed a few alcoholics sitting on the bench. According to them, they had been sitting since about 8 p.m. And according to them, again, during that time a grandmother, who lived on the first floor, and a single mother, who lived on the second floor, came into the entryway, who, again, didn't see or hear anything. No one came out of the staircase during that time. By the way, my grandfather immediately thought it was a dog. Well, what else would be able to maul a man in the entrance of the city? It turned out that the entryway had 2 dogs, but both were small dogs, clearly incapable of inflicting such wounds, which was confirmed later at the autopsy. The head was indeed separated from the body, as if by the teeth of a large animal. The spine was literally crushed at the point of the bite, and on the leg one of the bites gave a very clear and distinct jaw mark. According to the expert, as if deliberately showing off, traces of each tooth of the upper and lower jaw were visible, and this does not happen, well, at least never in his experience. So, the jaw really resembled a dog's, but very large, and there were as many as 48 teeth marks. And a normal dog, for a minute, has only 42 teeth, maybe less. More is very rare, and not much more. Now a couple of my comments. A dog could really chew a person's head off in 15 to 20 minutes, I'm saying this as a big dog owner myself. No, my dog didn't bite anyone's head off, if anything, but he can chew through a thick bone in 10 minutes, but there would be a lot of fucking fighting and screaming sounds. You can skip the screaming, assuming that somehow the dog jumped right up and grabbed the throat, biting the larynx, which is acceptable given the size of the jaw, but seriously. No one noticed a huge dog coming out / going in without an owner, which must seriously exceed the size of a sheepdog. Such animals are usually remembered. Another oddity is that there was blood only immediately adjacent to the body. Neither below nor above the stairs was there any blood. It was as if the man had been put on the floor first, and then his head was quietly chewed off, all in peace and quiet. By the way, my dog once had a run-in with an aggressive stray boxer, and there was a lot of blood. It fucking dripped from the dog's mouth and chest on the way home, but there is more blood in a human. Nothing like that here, it's clean. So here we have something big, appearing on the landing between the floors. There's no garbage chute in the house, even if we take this crazy version of a body appearing in the stairwell, silently biting off a grown man's head and leaving a dozen wounds on his body without any resistance, and then disappearing just as silently. That's the way it is. And they explained all this, by the way, by a stray dog attack, and closed the fucking case, notifying several local dog catchers that they should do a better job. I came across these pictures, and I'll tell you about them. I'll tell you right away, this story may seem funny to someone may say something about Beznognym, a Russian meme about an interrupted television broadcast, and Varj will make a joke, but all the same, personally I really like something about it, something in it is edgy, and when I saw the lights in the forest, which will be discussed, I shit my pants, figuratively speaking. And it will be longer than the first one, but get ready. The next one will be for fuck knows how many posts. It was the winter of '95. One evening, about 8 o'clock, a very unusual guest came to the police station, the priest of the church, which, by the way, is located in the remotest fucking parts of our town. He came not just for fun, but to write a statement about the threats he was receiving regularly. He brought with him a pile of notes, written in block letters on scraps of notebook paper. They were written with a lot of mistakes, which the duty officer laughed at. The mockery, by the way, was not very long. According to the statement, he regularly found these notes in his mailbox, first every 3 days, and then every day. As soon as the threats became more frequent, he decided to actually write a complaint. After that, when asked if he wanted to add anything, the priest was shaky and said uncertainly that he had recently begun to hear slapping noises in his apartment, as if someone was slapping the linoleum in the hallway and in the kitchen, very distinctly. When asked if he had checked what was spanking, the priest said no, he was sitting in his room and praying, trusting in the Lord. He was frightened, in a word, and was afraid they would take him for a madman. He was taken in, but the clerk on duty did not raise an eyebrow. But as there was already a lot to do, and they seriously doubted the sanity of the priest after his story, the statement, along with the notes, were put aside, and forgotten for a while. And now, a little over a week later, an investigative team sets off on a call. In the woods, about 200 to 250 meters inland, in the clearing that you can see in the photo, that is, I think that this is the clearing, the signs fit, they found a body. And the corpse was not just anyone, but, as you have already guessed, it was that of the father. The condition of the body was very fucked up, almost all the muscle tissue on the arms and legs were missing, the body had rotten stains, blisters, and distorted facial features from decomposition. The only things that immediately identified him were the cross, which, if I may say so, was the only item of clothing on his body, his long hair, and his beard. It was later determined that he had been dead for 7.5 to 8 days before the body was found. In addition, the body was definitely indoors. It would not have had time to decompose so badly in the cold. That was confirmed, first of all, by the testimony of the retired man who called the police. He used to walk his dog in the same woods every day along the same route, and he only discovered the body that very morning. Secondly, and strangest of all, around the body were a decent amount of tracks, resembling large palms. Not resembling, in fact, that's what they were. It just seemed like a lot of bullshit, to quote my grandfather. From the cleared road that ran along the edge of the forest, there was also a trail of exactly the same tracks. Strangely enough, parallel to the path, through the snowdrifts. There was no sign of a body being dragged anywhere. The rest of the tracks belonged to the old man and the investigation team. There had been a very heavy snowfall the night before and the tracks would have been blocked for sure, so the body definitely did not lie there for long, and it obviously did not come by itself. The interrogation of the pensioner, interrogations of inhabitants of 2 neighboring houses, and the guards of the garage cooperative next door haven't made anything clear at all, except that the dissatisfied veteran constantly complained that he repeatedly found dead bodies of animals in this clearing, either cats, or dogs, or rats, or crows. He called the police, wrote applications, but nothing was ever done, and the dead bodies he had to bury himself. He also shared his opinion about the goddamn Satanists, of course. The place itself is isolated, even the very neighboring houses were 600 to 700 meters away, the garage cooperative was somewhere in that order. Neither cars parked nearby, nor strange people, nor ordinary people with a large bag/sword were seen. In short, no hoo-ha. That's when we remembered the notes. We went to look, but even there, in fact, a couple of sentences, the essence of which boiled down to, "Renounce your faith, otherwise we will kill you." But the ones that were apparently planted later were more interesting. "Take off the cross, or you will starve yourself," my grandfather quoted from memory. There were some other strange messages, but he did not remember, unfortunately, and I, though sorry now, did not insist that he by old relationships open the archive. All of the notes had a bunch of grammatical errors, as I've written before. There was no point in conducting a handwriting examination for obvious reasons, don't ask. So, they gave them for fingerprinting and went to the father's apartment. The front door was unlocked, and there were no signs of forced entry on either lock. Bearing in mind the father's words about slapping palms, without much hope they arranged another, much more extensive fingerprinting of the floor in the hallway and kitchen. Suddenly, several clear fingerprints. Not even large, but big fingers came out, definitely not the father's. Fit for a hammerhead of some kind, or a blacksmith, to quote my grandfather. But everything seemed to be in place in the apartment, there were no signs of a struggle, no traces of blood, and the obvious valuables like religious icons were also still there. But there is no one to ask. By and large, the priest lived alone, no relatives, he was an orphan. In short, the prints on the note were exactly the same as those on the floor in the apartment, but there was no match in either the branch or the regional card index. Meanwhile, the autopsy showed that the muscles in his arms and legs had not been eaten by animals, as everyone initially thought, but had been removed quite neatly, with surgical precision even. Either a scalpel or a very sharp small knife. There were no marks on the body other than incisions in the arms and legs, no traces of known poisons, and so on. The parish was questioned, but the priest had not been to church since the day he went to the police. This led to the conclusion that he had disappeared after the visit to the police station, since the murder took place after the evening service in the church, or on the way home, or on the way out of the apartment, given the open door. Questioning the tenants of the house showed that he did not seem to come home, and one grandmother even rang his doorbell at about 9 p.m., for advice. They said, she came home. She came for advice, but he did not open the door. She did not hear any suspicious noises and did not see any suspicious people. That was a dead end. They checked, of course, the invalids, clinging to these very palms, so to speak. First of all, they checked those who lived close to the priest. There were a lot of them after the Afghan War and Chechnya. They searched the whole town, but no matches were found. They didn't expect any, honestly. They put it all down to the same cultists and gave up on the case. I told you about it in the first story. Well, I don't seem to have forgotten anything. Of course, if the priest hadn't been ignored from the start, he might have had more to say and it might have led to a solved case in the end, but it is what it is, and it stinks of mysticism, if you ask me. By the way, here's another photo taken around 11 a.m., the one in the first post, I took the next morning, when I took the dog for a walk. The same lights I wrote about in the very beginning. The zoom didn't do anything. If you're so curious, I can take a zoomed photo, but you can fucking see it, and the flash on the camera fucked me up so bad that I tried to fuck off, afraid they might notice, although I'm not that much of a pussy, mind you. It's just creepy in those woods when you know the story. The lights are just about where this clearing is located. Definitely not cigarettes, too far away, in that proverbial 200 to 250 yards. Probably small bonfires or motorcycle tail lights. You can't get your car there between the trees, the path is too narrow, and it doesn't look like it. Well, gentlemen, let's move on. There won't be much mysticism here, and as Anon aptly put it in the thread above, the question here is not that it was impossible to do, but why the fuck would you do it? So, here we go. It was in 91, it was a hard time, the degree of fuck-ups and ignorance about the job was off the charts almost everywhere, which has played its role in this story. No one was sure about the future of the country, that's for sure. It all started with a visit to a very unpleasant address and very shitty circumstances. You can see the house in which these events took place in the accompanying photo. For as long as I can remember, it has always been considered a bad place. Not because it was haunted or any of that shit. It was more prosaic than that. It was a former dorm that was filled with people from the lower social classes or with really unlucky people. People were regularly robbed, stabbed, and killed there. Even as a kid I had a chance to see for myself the morals of the inhabitants while riding a bike nearby. A severed head was thrown out of the window of one of the upper floors and landed about 30 meters away from me. According to rumors, drug addicts had a fight over something. But never mind, it's just so you understand what kind of atmosphere reigned there and why I did not go there to take pictures of the right stairwells and apartment doors. Yes, I pussied out. So, in one of the second-floor apartments, a family was murdered, consisting of a single mother, a 7-year-old daughter and, as it later turned out, about a year-old infant. The family was, as they say, from the very bottom of society. The elderly neighbor, who was almost driven to a heart attack by what she saw, explained later that the mother had never worked, drank heavily, and constantly took men of dubious appearance to her house. The daughter was practically homeless, she had never heard of kindergarten or school in her life. And how an infant survived in all this, it is not clear at all. According to my grandfather, the words of such old Soviet women can safely be divided by 2 to get something close to the truth, but it looked like shit in any case. The door was ajar, which allowed that very curious neighbor to discover the bodies. As for the condition of the bodies, it all looked like ordinary domestic violence at first glance. Overkill, though. There were about 30 stab wounds on each body, which, according to the first expert's opinion, were at least 2 days old. By the way, the expert suggested that the knife had already been used on the corpses. The mother had been killed in the kitchen, with traces of a struggle in the form of overturned stools, torn refrigerator handles and broken dishes, a bottle of, surprisingly, expensive vodka and various slightly rotten delicacies on the table, which looked very unusual on the shabby plywood table. The daughter, on the other hand, looked as if she had been slaughtered in her sleep, as she lay in her bed in the fetal position, no sign of struggle. As for the infant, there was no trace of him, except in the playpen in the daughter's room. His very existence was confirmed only by the words of the old woman, and later by other neighbors, and the playpen, no diapers, no baby food, no baby carriage, no birth certificate, nothing, which, however, can be assumed, given the social status of the family. Even a cursory inspection of the apartment revealed something interesting. Not only was the fridge overflowing with expensive food and alcohol, in the freezer was found a very large, for those days, sum of money in the form of several rolls of cash, packed in several bags, which was then a quite standard way of hiding valuables from thieves. But where could such poor people get it from? That was what raised questions, because the connection between the death of the apartment owners who were so obviously penniless and the money was obvious. Next, interviews with the residents of the entrance and the drinkers in the yard clarified 3 things at once. First, the murdered woman was a popular woman, if you know what I mean, and her apartment door was open as a rule. Second, according to the testimony of several people at once, in the last week she frequented a certain man, obviously not from around here. Descriptions diverged in some ways, but in general you can get the following picture: of uncertain age, completely bald, every time wearing the same brown 3-piece suit, patent leather shoes, bow tie. He was dressed to perfection, in a word. Such people rarely, if ever, came into the house, and that is a separate question, why no one thought of robbing him or at least just beating him up, because such people in such places, to put it mildly, are very disliked. Many saw him go into the entranceway, into the apartment of the murdered woman, but no one saw him leave. Another strange thing is the unusual, according to those who talked to the man, manner of speech. Everyone with whom he talked, this man asked him something, but no one could remember what it was about, which, in general, can be easily written off to the fact that 80% of the residents of this building would drink every day. They could not explain exactly, they called it flowery, pretentious, old-fashioned, very polite. They had seen him at least 3 times in the last week, but in the last 3 days before the police arrived no one had seen him, no one remembered his facial features or special features at all. And finally, third, as soon as the man was spotted outside the house for the first time, the murdered woman stopped receiving visitors, and for the first time in many years no screams or rumblings or cries of a child were heard from her apartment. There was definitely a baby, according to most of those interviewed, but no one remembered the woman walking around pregnant. To make a long story short, they took the bodies away for an autopsy. When they loaded them up, it looked like every single bone in them was broken, like rag dolls. Further examination of the apartment produced nothing, no sign of forced entry, no traces of blood, except for what was already there, nothing. Fingerprints were taken, of course, but no prints were found on the glasses and bottle on the table, other than those of the apartment's landlady. The doorknobs of the apartment doors gave such a fucking great number of different fingers that it was a fucking hassle to check them in the file cabinet. But not to bore you with a long and tedious story that will lead nowhere, almost all the fingerprints belong to the lowlifes from the same area who don't know anything and haven't seen this woman for at least 2 weeks. But the results of the autopsy and forensic examination were fucking interesting. Indeed, the stabs were made on bodies that had been dead for about 24 hours at that time. But fuck it. The autopsy showed that all the bones in the body, with the exception of the skull and cervical vertebrae, had become very brittle and had actually been destroyed by the impact of whatever the fuck it was. They were definitely not shattered by the blows, there were no bruises on the bodies, and it would be too much trouble to shatter every bone, and the body would look like a bloody, jagged sack in this case. The expert was reminded of the effect of highly concentrated hydrofluoric acid on a person, but there are two big buts here. Firstly, hydrofluoric acid in such concentration leaves fucking serious chemical burns. Considering that all the bones were destroyed, the woman and the girl had to be bathed in a bathtub with this acid, no other way, and no external injuries, except the stab wounds, were found. Secondly, this acid leaves such a chemical bouquet in the body that tests would have clearly revealed it, and here there was a critical lack of calcium in the bones, that's all. At about the same time, a call comes in from one of the interviewed residents of the house, saying he saw the same man entering the old boiler house near the house where the murder took place. Without thinking long, my grandfather grabs 2 operatives and drives out. The door to the boiler room did indeed turn out to be open. Whether it had been opened by the intruder or by the workers, they never found out, but the fact is, there was supposed to be a lock. In the pictures you can see the building with the boiler room. Inside, sorry, I did not climb in. There was already a padlock on the gate, and to climb over the concrete fence with a barbed wire, another pleasure. Inside, 2 middle-aged women were found. By the way, according to the rules, the boiler room staff should consist of 5 or 6 people, I do not remember exactly, and apparently that's why one of the tanks fucking exploded there, knocking out the glass in the neighboring house, when I was a kid. The women were visibly nervous and didn't act particularly adequately, as if they were scared. When asked if anyone suspicious had entered the property, they laughed nervously, denying it. They were just cartoonishly fucked up, my grandfather said. Well, fuck the women, one operative was left with them to keep an eye on the boiler readings, and he, in turn, kept an eye on them and the entrance to the building at the same time, while the grandfather and the other operative went to inspect the building. The building was fucked up, by the way. The building, as you can see in the photo, is old and has many stories. So it was all damp, rusty, and there was only one working light for about a dozen of the bulbs, so they had to go back for the lanterns. At the far unused end of the boiler room building, where no one had looked in years, was found a vest hanging in a tangle of pipes. They searched everything, looked under every pipe, literally, checked the entire area, no one was there. Then they called an expert and fingerprinted the pipes next to the vest, but the result was the same. There was no trace of blood on the vest, and no trace at all. It was as if it had just been washed. The women were later summoned for questioning, one kept denying it, and the other completely disappeared after the first interrogation. As we found out from a conversation with her fucking alcoholic husband, she had gone somewhere, without even packing her things. So be it. However, her colleague and husband were subjected to questioning. At any rate, they checked all the connections, all for naught. They were completely ordinary women. They even rolled their fingers and tried to find a match for the prints in the apartment of the murdered men, but it was a complete fiasco. At this point everything stalled for a while. There was simply nowhere to dig. And suddenly, about a month later, a call at the same address from the same old lady. According to her, from behind the door of the dead woman's apartment, which, by the way, was sealed up, there was a sound of a child crying. A police team was on its way. Here is where the grandfather said that the unreality of what was happening was palpable. A sealed door to a dead apartment with no sign of forced entry, and a child's soft crying could really be heard from behind it. They called the Housing and Utilities Department, and explained the situation. They waited for half an hour until someone brought them the keys, even though they were less than a kilometer away. They opened the door, and indeed in the playpen, standing in its former place, there was a baby of about 1 year old. The only thing was, it had no eyes. That is, no blood, no nothing. As it turned out later, his eyes must have been surgically removed, because in their place was the usual pink skin with thin traces of scars, as if plastic surgery had been performed. No lesions or injuries other than that were found. If you're interested in his fate, first he was sent to a children's hospital and then to a nursery. I don't know what happened next, but I'm guessing an orphanage and a miserable life. Although now it would be interesting to know if anything interesting could have happened there. That's the way it is, gentlemen. I'm sick of typing all this, I confess. But I will write my grandfather's theory with a few thoughts of my own. He believed that the baby was, in fact, bought from the drunken woman, and that the buyer was the man in the three-piece suit. And either something went wrong, or having changed his mind, the man killed both the woman and her daughter as a witness. With the murder itself, things are no longer so clear. Let's assume that the stab wounds could either be faked, which is unlikely, the perpetrator is too skilled, and it would be foolish to think that by being able to leave no trace, he would think that he could fool experts, or disguise the puncture points through which a certain substance was delivered closer to the bones of the victims. Except that in both cases the blows were applied haphazardly and some parts of the victims' bodies were simply free of them, while others were densely littered with them. Again, the experts have never heard of poisons that work this way and are not identifiable. I could not Google it either. Further, this amount of money is not left to the corpses. It is too serious. And only a woman with a drunken brain could hope that the money would not be found in such an obvious place. But here's a fact, the money was there. I don't know where the two fucking women from the boiler room could be involved. By the way, the missing woman was never found. My grandfather often went back to the case and checked to see if she was back. Maybe that someone had managed to scare them seriously. But okay, that's a lot of guesswork. What the vest was doing there, again, I don't fucking know. Next. The baby. Where'd that woman get it anyway? Stolen. An abandoned baby? Scars from such operations don't heal in a month, as you know. That leaves the other kid, but why? Plus, here's the thing, those who had seen the child before he went missing claimed he had a birthmark on his head, on the right side of his forehead. The baby with no eyes had a birthmark in the same spot. With a sealed door that looked intact, God forbid. Everyone understands that it could have been locked by the dick, and he could have taken the spare keys with him when he left the apartment after the murder. But even without that, I think there are plenty of oddities in the minutiae of this story. Alright, that's it. You'll probably shit all over me for this not being a particularly mystical story, but there's plenty of that goodness in the next story. I must have missed something, but okay, I'm tired today. Well, I'm going to have to tell you that the mystique is postponed until next time, because I didn't choose the best time to take pictures. Not only did I almost shit my pants because of a strange man, but I couldn't even see a fucking thing. A few pictures would be good for a whole other story, though. You have to use your imagination. Here you have to imagine images of a couple of places that I was too far away to go / too scared to go / these places don't exist anymore. But there will be some tasty stuff here, too. So, here we go. It's 92, the country is still shaking, my grandfather continues his service in our town. One day a very strange guy showed up at the station, and he looked uncomfortable and shaken up. He looked, as my grandfather described him to me, like a drunken bum in dirty, shabby clothes. His passport was in order, however, and he had a residence permit. In short, he told me this, in some very remote and isolated area of the city, consisting of warehouses, a garage cooperative and an abandoned railroad depot, you can see its gate in the photo with a strange green glow. I don't know where it came from, but it looks funny. His friends started disappearing. By the way, I couldn't find out from anyone what the depot was for, but I've never seen a train on those fucked up tracks in my life. The people who were missing were not ordinary people, but real homeless people, who were hiding there from human eyes, and there was a scrap and copper recycling station nearby. This also explained why they had sent an emissary with a residence permit instead of one of their own, because nobody wants to go to the police station or get a couple of convictions on themselves, and this was, unfortunately, a very common practice. As he explained, something strange was going on. 3 days earlier, one of the bums had walked away from the fire to take a piss and never came back. About half an hour later, they lit some twigs and went looking for their friend with these improvised torches. It is unlikely that the man fell asleep in some ditch. But however they looked, they could not find their friend, though how much can drunken homeless people find in the dark, let's be honest. But he didn't come back in the afternoon or the next day. But they, in general, did not pay much attention to it, only complaining about fate. Moreover, even a whole bottle of vodka was lost that night, which for the homeless guys was apparently a valuable drink, worthy of escape. However, he had left all his small belongings in place, so they were already waiting for him, getting ready to kick his ass. The very next day, or rather night, another one of them disappeared under far more frightening circumstances. Still going to the bathroom, one of these gentlemen let out a terrible scream, having only managed to leave the circle of light and go behind the nearest bushes. The scream, however, was cut short almost immediately, which prompted the other homeless men to rush to the rescue. But then, according to the emissary, some growling, as he put it, made them stop. He didn't see shit himself, no one had time to think about torches. But someone said they had seen some scary man grinning out of the darkness, barely visible in the fire's distant light. In short, the bums got cold feet and retreated back to the fire, not sleeping a wink until dawn. The bums had to take extreme measures and turn to their, one might say, worst enemies after the punk kids, the police. The officer on duty had no formal grounds for not accepting the report. So they took the statement, discussed it over a smoke break, and decided to say fuck it, considering it half nonsense and half pranks of the same punk kids. They had enough to deal with as it was. But the next disappearance had already made the police think hard. A resident of the town had disappeared. We are not interested in his place of residence in this case, and I didn't know him either. An ordinary, in general, average man, who was not averse to getting drunk and having a dig in his tattered Muscovite at his leisure. He worked at a town-forming enterprise, but the main thing was that he was an exemplary family man, according to his wife, and never disappeared without warning. But here no one heard a word from him for 2 days. By the way, I do not know why the wife was delaying so long. It seemed that she should have run to the police as soon as the night had passed. To cut a long story short, the last place they saw him was, here's a surprise, in the same garage cooperative not far from the hobo's camp, where he left his car and went home by the usual and shortest route, which ran right along the old railroad tracks. Linking the disappearance of the bums with the disappearance of the man was, of course, an obvious thing to do. As you can see, in the photo with the depot gate, the forest surrounds the tracks tightly on both sides. The situation is the same on the other side, with the only difference that the road will be crossed by a bridge over those tracks, seen in the photo attached to this post. By the way, I did not get under it, because when I was a kid I had seen a corpse there, and the impression remained unpleasant, nothing interesting, a standard story of the late 90s, I will not dwell on this case. After the bridge the forest on the right continues, and on the left is a concrete fence, separating the railway tracks from the old warehouses. They were almost abandoned, and in the mid-2000s they were demolished, after which some building materials market was built, which is now abandoned, the fate of the place, so it seems. And so another 1.5 kilometers to the more or less bustling areas of the city. At first, of course, we thought they were homeless. But on the other hand, if any of them were involved, after the visit of their messenger to the police, they had obviously fucked off. But one operative was still sent to talk to them, however, he turned out to be either not very bright, or the homeless people had moved away, but he could not find them as a result. Grandpa and his group went to the same warehouses, which were the most obvious place to hide potential bodies. By the way, there was no watchman there at the time. Omitting tedious details, in one of the watchman's closets in the second storage room that we examined, we found a distinctive checkered shirt with traces of blood, which, judging by the wife's description, was worn by the very same man. In addition, there was a whole pile of junk, and a couple of mattresses that filled almost the entire small room. Other than that, the room looked almost dust-free, unlike the rest of the building. Fingerprinting gave a perfectly clear result, and the fingers were immediately sent to the file cabinet for verification. And then everyone was in for a surprise. It turned out that the fingerprints belonged to two escaped convicts who, for fuck's sake, escaped from prison somewhere near Solikamsk 15 years ago, and about whom everybody had long since forgotten. By the way, they were in prison for fairly serious crimes, rape, and something else, I can't remember already, and for some reason I didn't write it down. One was a local, and the other was from Moscow. The local one was 62 and the Moscow one was 41. The most obvious and logical thing to do was to check the place of residence of the local convict. The apartment on the first floor in a very bad neighborhood in a condemned building, which has now been demolished, was somehow already in the housing fund of our city. What a surprise it would have been if the convict had returned home legally, but it had been empty all this time. It turned out that getting the keys was an unnecessary concern, since the front door, a piece of plywood, was already open, the lock had been broken, to be exact. Inside, and more specifically the bathroom, was, without any exaggeration, fucking hell. The bloodstains on the floor and walls were already found in the hallway. But in the bathroom there was a whole tub filled with parts of several bodies, 3 incomplete sets, as it turned out later, lacking torsos and heads, which they could not fucking find, chopped up apparently with an axe, which, however, also could not be found in the end. It was filled with dirty, cold water, in which it was all floating. I don't fucking know where they got it, considering that all the services of the utility company were cut off a long time ago. The stench of dead bodies and shit, the toilet was filled with excrement, was already quite strong, but the neighbors did not call the police, which can be explained by the fact that no one lived on the first 3 floors except a blind old man from the second floor. In the kitchen we found a camping gas stove, a large tin with traces of blood on it, a half-empty sack of potatoes, and human bones piled in the corner of the same kitchen. This was where the realization came in. The convicts, whose fingers were all over the place, were eating these people. Who the fuck knows why and for what reason? You can also steal food, like potatoes, but they were eating them. Everything was pointing to it. Surveys of the tenants gave us nothing at all. The few people who still lived there, I can count them on the fingers of my two hands, all unanimously said that they did not see any unfamiliar men here. But that same blind grandfather said that the night before the police arrived there had been several hours of banging on his door, but they still hadn't been able to open it. That's when things got serious. They left 2 cops in the apartment, and my grandfather went to fuck around with the prosecutor's office and demanded that a higher authority deal with the case, because this was clearly not his case, and if it had gone any further, guess who the blame would have fallen on? Just kidding, a mass murder and 2 fugitive Zekars who were wanted by the police. The case was picked up rather quickly, with almost no restraint. The cops, who had been in the apartment all night and were pissed off by the stench and disgust, were taken off duty. But, looking ahead, none of the convicts ever went back there. Everyone who took part in the case was thoroughly interviewed. For those interested in questions of investigative jurisdiction, the bosses and the grandfather himself were beaten up for violating this very investigative jurisdiction, but after that everything went back to normal, no one gave a fuck, no one was fired, and then they went about it all themselves. And what comes next is, rumors told in the smoking room, but since I started telling a story, I need to finish it, even though I don't know the details. The trail of these convicts was found not far from the city, at the entrance to a large wooded area that stretches for several dozen kilometers. There was a place called a lodge, which was actually a country house cooperative of 40 houses. Apparently that's where they were told. But they couldn't get both of them. They had sort of already begun to be chased through the woods when they came across the older of the two, lying on the ground and moaning madly. According to the main version, his comrade had broken his leg with something heavy, and he ran away on his own. So they dragged him to the car, put him in the goat house, and took him away to be interrogated as soon as possible. He did not utter a word, he only howled and growled like an animal. The second, meanwhile, had to be hunted all over the piss-poor forest with dogs. In short, they could not find the fugitive, and the one with the broken leg howled and shook all the way, but calmed down after a while. It turned out he had bitten off his tongue. They saved him in the end, again, rumor has it. But they didn't learn a fucking thing from him, they found him insane, and locked him up in some kind of a maximum security hospital. For any word from the previous paragraph neither my grandfather could vouch, nor I will not vouch now, you see. There's only one version of the story, there's no mystery. 2 escaped convicts fucked around for about 15 years, making their way from the Urals to the suburbs of Moscow. Apparently, they suffered a lot along the way. Probably had to eat someone from hunger one day, at least a homeless person or a wayfarer. Apparently, they both had a head rush because they found something in the human flesh. And then they switched to a new menu, and more, judging by the behavior of the old convict, turning into fucking animals. It was only here, in the suburbs of Moscow, that they began to get cocky and eat someone who would missed, because it was not difficult to reach them, in fact. But there was another factor. It was as if they had some sort of animal instinct that they were always one step ahead of the police, getting the fuck out of each of their hideouts a day or two before the authorities got there. That was it. By the way, photographing those places was really frightening, knowing that in theory one of the two was still at large, even though he was supposed to be an old man, and that those places were remote dumps and would remain so. Although I would not want to be in the place of that blind grandfather from the condemned apartment building, that part of the story always creeped me out. This one happened in the summer of '96. It differs from the ones you read above in that, first of all, it took place in a quite prosperous district of our city, in which, by the way, I lived, and secondly, I heard part of the story firsthand, even before my grandfather told it to me. One night, at about 1 o'clock, a completely unhinged man ran into the department, practically holding in his arms a crying woman in a tattered dress. After calming the man down a bit, we started listening to the gist of the case, which consisted of the following. Some friends had come to the man, a small businessman, 32 years old, owned a couple of kiosks in his home district, after which he asked his wife, 27, housewife, to take the child, 8 months, boy, and walk around the house with him. What kind of friends were these, and why would he kick his wife and child out into the street at around 11 p.m.? The question is debatable, and they tried to work this fact into various versions, and they did, checking on these friends, who apparently had obvious ties to a large local organized crime group, who apparently received a steady kickback for covering his ass, because he was alive and well, and so were his kiosks. But more about that later. After about 1 hour and 10 minutes, he finally got rid of his friends and began to worry a lot. His wife had not yet arrived. He jumped out into the dark courtyard and did not find her. Started to go around the house in a circle, calling out her name, when suddenly, on the other side of the house, he literally ran into the baby carriage lying on the asphalt, not noticing it in the dark. The carriage was on the asphalt path, which you can see in the first photo. There were no lights near this road before or now. There are lights only about 30 meters away from the walkway on the edge of the forest, so yeah, you really can't fucking see anything at night in the area that you can see in the photo. The baby in the stroller, of course, was not there. At this point the man began to panic, but then he heard sobs nearby and rushed over to where he found his wife, sobbing and wandering between the trees in an almost unconscious state. Unable to get anything out of her, he put her in the car and drove her to the police station. My grandfather also could get very little out of her. She was very slow in responding and could not even say her name right away. She was in shock, so they called a doctor right away. But they did manage to find out some things, asking the same questions over and over again. To summarize her incoherent speech, it turned out that she was walking along the path behind the house when something big rushed over to her from behind the house, pushed her, snatched her child out of the baby carriage and rushed in the direction of the iron tower, and then toward the woods. She followed it all the way into the woods, but couldn't catch up. Also, she said something, that's what grandfather noted separately, there was then a version with a large animal, you'll find out later. A doctor arrived and examined her, finding bruises and minor scratches, which she must have received while running in the dark over rough terrain after her attacker. There were no more than minor injuries. The woman was really in a state of shock. The doctor advised giving her glycine, or glycerin, I don't fucking know what I wrote here, otherwise you'll fuck with me again, and putting her to bed, keeping her from stress. The doctor scolded my grandfather for interrogating her in such a state. If the lady's condition did not improve by the next day, he advised taking her to the hospital. Well, they decided, albeit without any hope, to look for the child on hot pursuit, taking with them a dog handler with a dog. Everything became clear almost at once with the iron tower. About 250 meters from the location of the carriage was an electricity tower, which is available in the photo. I actually found 2 of them, but the second is too far away, and they're near warehouses instead of the forest, so I put on the one that is in the second photo. On examining the stroller, the strangeness began immediately. The dog, a long-haired German Shepherd, a huge dog, I've seen this dog several times as a kid, he was really big, began to behave strangely, growling in the direction of the house, wagging his tail, reacting poorly to the commands of the dog handler, who went a little nuts, because the dog was very mature and never had problems with commands. He just made a suggestion about a large wild animal, which the dog, unused to hunting, could react so badly. There was a small tear in the fabric covering the baby carriage, but it was hardly taken into account. The fabric could have been torn at least by the baby carriage falling on the asphalt, covered with sharp pebbles and shards of glass, but grandfather noted it anyway. Maybe he had some thoughts about it. No traces of blood inside or on the ground around. Checked during the day, too, nothing like that, but the stroller was taken away for examination anyway, which yielded nothing. They reached the power line with difficulty because of the dog, which behaved completely irrationally and was not going to look for anything. They wondered what, in fact, to do next. There were no obvious signs and the dog could not help. So the dog handler and the dog were released and they decided to search the nearest part of the forest with flashlights to clear their conscience, which did not lead to anything. In the morning they called the man whose child was missing, but he reported that his wife was no better and he was taking her to the hospital. They sent her to a mental hospital for a while, but she didn't report anything new even after discharge, as if she had lost her memory. There was only one clue, the man's friends. But not to roll it all down into the most boring issues of criminal Russia, then, in short, this lead went nowhere. And judge for yourself, the businessman is too small, to put it mildly, and no demands followed this kidnapping. And what in all this history is strange and scary, you think? Well, a month later, at the same house, a similar incident occurred. Two brothers, the oldest 10, the youngest 7, were playing behind the house, climbing under the windows, hoping to find something interesting. The older one, of course, was forced by his parents' command to keep an eye on his brother. Further from the testimony of the older boy, who was brought to the police by his father. It was a little before 10 p.m., it was already time to go home when the older one suddenly noticed that the younger one was standing and staring into a dark alcove under the first floor balcony. You can see these in the first photo, maybe one of them is just the one in question. The brother called out to the kid several times, but he did not respond. He was on his way, but suddenly he stood up when furry paws came out of the doorway and dragged the child inside without making a sound. How could he see the paws fur from the darkness? Another question, because, as you remember, there were no flashlights. The lad stood still at first, staring into the darkness. He even thought he saw big white eyes, he couldn't see that for sure. And then he rushed as fast as he could home to his father, who was having a beer after work, who, after giving the boy a beating and not believing a word of it, went to look for his son, taking a flashlight with him. But after examining every niche, he found nothing at all, except a hole punched in the corner of one of the niches, which apparently led to the basement of the house. But it was too narrow for a grown man, a child would only fit through it. But the determined man did not calm down, took a crowbar, knocked down the lock of the basement door in the entranceway, and somehow climbed in. But after searching the entire basement, he found nothing. It smelled really bad, too, as confirmed by my grandfather, who was inspecting the basement later. A strange, kind of strong smell, but Grandpa didn't smell anything like that. But yes, nothing about the case could be found. That's the way it is, gentlemen. The funny thing about this case is that I knew this kid when he was a kid. We were in the same circle, he was a little older than me, and the story he told to the police is almost exactly the same as the one he told us after the events. He had never been much of a laughing stock, or a party animal, but after the events he went out rarely, became withdrawn and had an almost panicked fear of the back of his own house, flatly refusing to go there. So on the one hand, I personally believe him, but on the other hand, a child can make up a lot of things. But here we have the words of the woman, who, again, was in a state of shock and a fucked up witness, as well as the service dog that wagged its tail like a puppy, which is not typical in any way. The animal version is questionable, I think. Here you can say, first of all, what kind of big animals like to steal human kids and leave no trace? Seriously, two similar cases in one place, and for a month no one saw anything. And secondly, if you take into account the cellar doorway, a big animal simply isn't going to get into it. That leaves, of course, the friends of the man from the first case, but, as I said, it simply made no sense for them, because the second man had nothing to do with commerce or criminality, and they would probably have kidnapped both children. So I don't have any special ideas, to be honest.